All right, I think we are live on YouTube as well as NGO CSW. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Journalist Emeritus Foundation CSW 65 panel discussion on the role of women in the peace and security agenda, Security Council Resolution 1325. I am Cemre Ülker, the UN representative of the Journalist Emeritus Foundation. So today we have a very important agenda to discuss. All right, I think we are live on YouTube as well. Great experts. But before we move on, I would like to briefly introduce the Journalist Emeritus Foundation. We are an international civil society organization dedicated to promote the culture of peace, human rights, and sustainable development. We are also associated with the UN Department of Global Communications. Besides our human rights advocacy and youth empowerment programs, we create international platforms gathering together NGOs from all around the world to facilitate collaborations for the better implementation of the sustainable development goals, both at local and global level. As the gender mainstreaming of the global goals is a priority for the Journalist Emeritus Foundation, CSW is a very important timeline for us. Since 2013, we have been very active during the CSW sessions by organizing many events addressing diverse topics of women's empowerment. And this year we are co-organizing 6 panel sessions in collaboration with our global partners from Australia, South Africa, and Brazil. So today we are with pioneer institutions in the field with great experts who are passionate to empower women as the agents of long-lasting peace. Last year, it was the 20th anniversary of the resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. It's a landmark document underlining the critical role of women peace builders, both at formal and informal positions. UN figures show that women's inclusion in formal and both informal peace processes is still very low. Women make up only 6% of the signatories and 13% of negotiators. And while, of course, women have made important accomplishments in national and political offices across the globe, World Bank data indicates that their representation in national parliaments is still far from parity. So despite the well-known challenges, we have to keep up our efforts to increase women's critical participation in this area because many country cases show that our presence in ceasefires and peace building is proven to be substantially long-lasting. And today in our agenda with Mavic, Savita, and Grant, we will focus on the Security Council resolutions implementation, empowerment of women leaders in peace building, women's role in responsibility to protect, and atrocity crimes with a particular focus on gender-based violations. I just want to note that we will open the floor for questions and comments, feedbacks from the audience as well at the very end of the discussion. In the meantime, you're more than welcome to write your comments, questions, or any reflections in the chat box as well. So moving right into our discussion, our first speaker for today is Mavic Cabrera Baleza, the founder and chief executive officer of the Global Network of Women Peace Builders. She's one of the 2 civil society initiators of the Women's Peace and Security Fund. Mavic is also one of the founding members of its Global Funding Board. She is also a board member of the Generation Equality Compact on Women, Peace, Security, and Humanitarian Action. She has provided technical support in 1325, national action planning in different countries, including Guatemala, Japan, and South Sudan. And she also facilitated costing and budgeting workshops in Georgia, Jordan, Lebanon, and Nepal. Mavic, thank you so much for joining us today. And for our audience to know more about, and as a starting question really, can you please provide us a bit of a background information on this important Security Council resolution and what significance does it have for women's empowerment?
Thank you very much,
Yes.
Semre. Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you to the Journalists and Writers Foundation for organizing this important discussion. And it's very much in line with the theme of the CSW, which is women's equal participation in decision making. And that, in fact, is one of the key pillars of Resolution 1325. So the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 is one of the most important international laws ever adopted by the Security Council. Unanimously adopted in October 2000, it draws attention to the disproportionate impacts of armed conflicts on women and girls and how conflicts intensify pre-existing gender inequalities, discrimination, and violence, while at the same time, it also stresses that gender inequality is one of the drivers of conflict. The resolution reaffirms the important role of women in the prevention and resolution of conflicts, in peace negotiations, peace building, peacekeeping, humanitarian response, and in post-conflict reconstruction. It stresses the importance of their equal and meaningful participation in all efforts and all levels of decision making on peace and security. I think it's very important to always underscore all levels of decision making, because when it is informal and it is at the local community level, women are very visible, well recognized, but when it becomes formal and high level and official, they disappear because they are not regarded as the experts, even though they have been working on peace building for decades, even before the Resolution 1325 was adopted. So there's something wrong in how in the frameworks of official peace negotiations. The resolution also calls on all parties to conflict to take special measures to protect women and girls' rights and to protect them from sexual and gender-based violence, particularly rape and other forms of sexual abuse in situations of armed conflict. And here, I just would like to share that the pillars of 1325, which I've already explained before summarizing them, which are commonly referred to as the 3Ps: participation, protection, and prevention, and 2Rs, relief and recovery. I just wanted to nuance a little bit more the issue of protection and prevention. And when we're talking of prevention, we're not only talking of prevention of sexual and gender-based violence per se, but equally important, prevention of armed conflicts themselves. Because for as long as there's armed conflicts, the likelihood of sexual and gender-based violence also increases. And protection, it's not just, again, protection from sexual and gender-based violence, but the protection from but protection of their rights, because when the rights of women and girls are recognized, they can protect themselves. They're not dependent on others to defend them. Relief and recovery is also very important. It is highlighted even more during this global health crisis. And it is important to have strong gender lens in our humanitarian action efforts. Otherwise, women and girls will just continue to be seen as refugees, as displaced people, as victims. They are not passive victims. They are active, they take action, they are leaders, peace builders, and decision makers.
Thank you. And it's very important that you underline that. Yes, even though they may be unequally impacted by violence and armed conflict, we have to put a great stress that they're not dependent and they are the stakeholders of peace building. So thank you for that remarks. So Mavik, given your distinguished background in working with different countries as well for their implementation procedures of this important resolution, and we are now here with a group of civil society leaders, and I think it's a very timely question. So what is the role of civil society organizations in assisting member states and for the implementation process of the resolution?
There will be no Resolution 1325 or the Women, Peace and Security agenda broadly without civil society, particularly women's rights organizations. Not only that civil society advocated for the adoption of Resolution 1325, civil society were actually co-drafters of the resolution. So there's a very, very strong ownership of this foundational resolution. And in the last 20 years, it is civil society that has kept the resolution alive. We in civil society raise awareness, promote ownership. We advocate with governments to develop and implement impactful regional, national, and local action plans. We monitor the implementation. We make critical and constructive recommendations. And we lobby for dedicated funding for the implementation of action plans and especially women's participation in decision-making on peace and security matters, including official peace negotiations. And it is also civil society who leads the call for the prevention and elimination of conflict-related sexual violence. Civil society provides shelters to victims, medical assistance, psychosocial counseling services, legal assistance to victims and their families. And we continue to document and report about conflict-related sexual violence and demand accountability. But I must also emphasize that, because part of your question is, what is the role of civil society in assisting member states? I must also emphasize that it is not the responsibility of civil society to assist member states. It's the other way around. Member states are put in, or government officials are put in power, and part of their mandate, or an important part of their mandate, is to serve their citizens, including protecting and promoting their rights. But we do, civil society support them. And at the same time, we hold them accountable to their obligations under the law, including international laws like Resolution 1325. And civil society often also act directly to solve critical problems, as I also cited our work in supporting victims and survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. And that role of civil society has never been more highlighted than during these pandemics, when governments are inefficient or paralyzed by their politicking. It is civil society who first steps forward, and women peace builders and have taken on the role of first responders and frontliners during this pandemic. So we occupy a very important part in society, and that too, I must add, is capacitating or enhancing the capacity of local women and youth and local populations to participate in decision making. Active citizens who uphold democracy.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, the sole responsibility is on the shoulders of the member states. But we see that for some oppressive countries, the civil society is needed to create this political will to push the member states and to recall on their responsibilities to implement such important agendas. Thank you so much. And maybe lastly, I have been following the great impact that your organization is creating. So I would like to know more about how does the global network of women peace builders empower women leaders to be active agents of peace building?
We have 4 strategies. The first one is we call from local to global, from words to action, which is actually the full cycle implementation of the Women, Peace and Security resolution. So we work with civil society, and we also work with member states with the condition that civil society is a key partner in their response to the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So this full cycle implementation involves anywhere between advocating with member states to develop national and local action plans. And by the way, there are so far 96 member states who have adopted national action plans. So advocating for them to develop and adopt, but equally, if not more importantly, to ensure that those national action plans or local action plans are implemented. So we also provide technical support in developing monitoring and reporting mechanism. We also provide support in gender responsive budgeting for those national action plans. And another important feature is localizing those action plans, that they don't only stay in the capital, but they are actually implemented in communities directly affected by conflict. So if we take the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, the national action plan should not only stay in Kinshasa, it should be, implemented in North Kivu, in South Kivu, in the different territories under those conflict-affected provinces. And we also work very actively with the media to raise awareness and generate public support. We need to go out of our echo chamber to ensure that there's broad public support for Resolution 1325 and for the Women, Peace and Security agenda broadly. The second strategy is what we refer to as local voices in global spaces. We were busy before COVID. We traveled, we always travel local women and youth peace builders to the UN for them to advocate for their issues and concerns themselves. We always emphasize that the Global Network of Women Peace Builders is not the spokesperson for local women leaders and youth leaders. We want them to be able to speak in their own authentic voices, and we create channels and we support them to do that. The third strategy is also is focused on young people, but especially young women. So some of us are probably aware that there are now 3 youth peace and security resolutions, and we promote the synergy between youth peace and security and women peace and security agenda. And we focus on empowering and creating spaces for young women. And this work is also done internationally. We have this network called Young Women Leaders for Peace in Bangladesh, Indonesia, DRC, Myanmar, Philippines, Ukraine are some of the countries. And fourth is supporting feminist, localized humanitarian action and crisis response. And we know for a fact that most of the humanitarian emergencies are because of conflict. And yet, the response to humanitarian emergencies doesn't integrate a peace and security lens. So that's what we promote, a gender responsive and conflict sensitive response to humanitarian emergencies, including the ongoing pandemic. And last but not the least, I forgot to mention, we also very active in research. We partner with academic institutions such as the New York University Center for Global Affairs and the Georgetown Institute of Women, Peace and Security to ensure that we have evidence-based instruments in our advocacy through our various research. So I'll stop here and look forward to the contributions from our other our amazing co-panelists and the audience members.
Thank you so much, Mavik. And I really endorse this strategy of localizing any sort of agenda. It's not only applicable methodology for peace building. I think for sustainable development, the local ownership of civil society leaders, women's rights pioneers, activists is very important, and media as well is a very essential tool in the implementation phases. Thank you so much. As you said, I'm sure we're gonna come back to you for feedbacks or any questions from the audience. Thank you so much, Mavik. Next, we have Savita Pandey. She's the Deputy Executive Director of the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. Ms. Pandey oversees Global Center's programming in New York and Geneva, and also leads developing innovative institutional mechanisms and capacities needed to prevent mass atrocities at both national and international level. In 2010, Ms. Pounday was instrumental in launching the global network of R2P focal points. Currently, she is involved in leading global center engagement with UN peacekeeping and identifying strategies, including training on how to enhance protection capacities of peacekeepers on the ground. So, Savita, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have you on board. And humanitarian intervention has been a challenging question, a controversial issue on when and how it happens, which circumstances to address. And I think the responsibility to protect really puts a light on this international dilemma. So, can you please inform us on the norm of responsibility to protect?
Thank you, Samra. Thank you for having me, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this wonderful panel. And CSW is always so energetic and invigorating. So, really privileged to be part of this panel, and in the presence of such accomplished women. So, thank you again. And in a nutshell, and this is what I do day in, day out. So, I have a very prepared answer here. So R2P is a global norm. It was unanimously agreed upon by 150 heads of state and government in 2005 at the UN World Summit. R2P aims at preventing and halting the four crimes of genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. R2P stipulates that it is the primary responsibility of a state to protect its populations from these four crimes. It's the responsibility of the international community to assist and encourage individual states in upholding this responsibility. And if a state is manifestly failing, then the international community must take appropriate collective action in a decisive and timely manner and in accordance with the UN Charter. So that is the responsibility to protect. And R2P, when it was adopted, it was seen as, and even now for advocates like me who work on this, it's a political commitment and a call to action that politics as usual cannot take place when populations are subjected to conscience shocking crimes like genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. It emerged, as many of you already know, from the failures of the international community in Rwanda as well as in Srebrenica in the 1990s. And it was designed as a new operational sort of, and here it is important to emphasize this, operational and a political response to accomplishing the idea of never again, that the world cannot sort of stand back and witness these things always, and to sort of counter a politics of indifference. Because it's not as if legal obligations do not exist. There is a genocide convention, there are other protocols which provide legal obligations to states to act, but R2P was seen primarily as sort of a political call to action, a political and operational way of how to address and prevent the commission of these crimes. And very much the aim of R2P was to not only be a crisis management, sort of this humanitarian intervention, sharp end of the tool, but rather to think in terms of prevention, in terms of what are the different steps that states and the international communities, regional organizations can take to prevent atrocities from taking place, to prevent, to create an environment where it's not possible for the commission of these kinds of crimes. And R2P is very narrow. It's about the four crimes, and these four crimes are defined in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And in terms of sort of implementation, there are three pillars of R2P, which was sort of put forth in the first report of the Secretary General, the way it was conceptualized. And the three pillars of R2P is, the first one is the primary responsibility of the state. So that would include sort of activities that states should uphold, from sort of constitutional and legal protection of human rights and minority rights, adopting laws against hate speech and incitement, adopting education curricula that doesn't demonize one community over others, memorializing, acknowledging past atrocities, creating policies that address social biases against certain ethnic groups or racial communities, um, So that's pillar one. Pillar two of the norm is about international assistance. So that is financial assistance and development assistance. But it also means denying perpetrators, denying individual countries or state actors the ability to perpetrate crime. So that means, cutting off, imposing bilaterally arms embargoes, to cutting off military training, aid, etc. That's what we are calling for people to do in Myanmar, for countries to do in Myanmar. So denying them means to not commit atrocities. And finally, it's what you started the question, which the humanitarian interventions. We don't really go in that direction that much, but it's basically coercive and non-coercive actions, from diplomacy to good offices to targeted sanctions, commissions of inquiries, referrals to the ICC, and in last case scenario, definitely the sharpest end of the tool, which is a military intervention. So that's what R2P is about.
Thank you so much for this wonderful overview. And you mentioned about the three pillars of the R2P, and also noted that it's the responsibility, of course, of the member states to act collaboratively or individually in the case of a need of a response to the rising crimes against humanity. But as stakeholders, as Mavik also underlined, women are the stakeholders of long-lasting peace-building processes. So very similar question, but now to focus on R2P, what is the role of women in societies to initiate this norm, to assist or to contribute, if correct to say?
So, Samara, I'll start with the assumption that women always continue. They're always have been, they'll always will be, they are part of the solution, they're part of mitigation strategies. So that's a given. So I'll just answer this question a little bit differently and focus on what we can do better in terms of including women and including gendered analysis and how we prevent and respond to atrocities. So here, sort of looking at, and I have sort of 5 points to make. One is, so there's this framework of analysis for atrocity crimes, which is developed by the Office of the Prevention of Genocide and R2P. It's the only UN tool which basically identifies the risk of atrocities in particular situations or countries. Now, this tool is actually very gender insensitive. It mentions gender once, essentially in the entire document in the context of a form of discrimination, and mentions women twice in the context of reproductive rights and in the context of sexual and gender-based violence. And this is really problematic because atrocities by their nature have a gendered impact. They impact men, women, boys, and girls differently. So to have an entire document, which is a fantastic document, by the way, to be gender insensitive is quite interesting. Also, maybe because the other fact is that it doesn't capture things like indicators such as extreme structural and institutional forms of gender inequality or targeted violence against women, as we have seen in Afghanistan to Iraq, South Sudan, Myanmar, which are a risk factor for atrocity crimes. So, we have seen that again, early warning systems fall short of gender-specific indicators, including a systematic application of gender-sensitive monitoring or data collection. Second, a huge amount of attention within the atrocity community is paid or is focused on sexual and gender-based violence to the exclusion of other indicators. Again, as I mentioned, state sanctioned gender-based discrimination or level of prosecution of crimes or targeted violence against women are all important indicators, but they're sometimes not taken into account because the focus so much is on sexual and gender-based violence. And this is again a problem because when we understand how atrocities happen, to prevent, to respond to atrocities, we first need to understand who is vulnerable, why are they vulnerable, what are the points of escalation, how is the pattern of attack going to emerge on a certain community, on a certain group, may that be an ethnic group, women, men, boys, girls, again. So it's very important to take into account different indicators. So like I'll give you an example in terms of Nigeria and Boko Haram. Now Boko Haram is against Western education and they consistently targeted educational institutions and particularly educational institutions of girls. I mean, all of us remember the Chibok girls who were abducted, 270 girls that were abducted. Now, and Taliban has done the same thing, attacked women and particularly targeted their ability to access education. Now, if and here it is important to think in terms of like what are the different sex aggregated ways in which patterns of violence against women are emerging. It's not only sexual and gender based violence, it's different kinds of indicators here which are important. Third, I mean, as Mavik also said, women play a multitude of roles. We are important in terms of mitigation strategies, but also women can be perpetrators. Women are complicit in commission of atrocities. And at the same time, again, I'm underlining Mavik's point here, is that women's organizations in most countries, I mean, in terms of like developing resilience to atrocities, it's in many cases, it's women's grassroots, organizations which implement human rights within local communities, but somehow they're completely missing from the international national policy making. So again, my third point is about inclusion of women in high level international national policy making in terms of understanding protection strategies and response strategies. Um, Again, in conflict as well as in post-conflict settings, the other thing to understand is that we need to highlight women's experience of atrocity crimes in particular. So from fact-finding missions to commissions of inquiry to other investigative mechanisms which monitor and investigate and establish basically facts and circumstances of the abuses that have taken place must and should include women's perspective, should be gender sensitive. And this is particularly also important in cases where sexual and gender-based violence is an important characteristics of the conflict. And finally, I would just say that it's really important for us to think about, I mean, and as I'm working on peacekeeping, it's very much in the forefront of my mind, not only in terms of recruitment, but how we interact with local communities. So I'll end with a positive example where the interaction between sort of prioritization of both the R2P and WPS agenda resulted in better results. So when Mary Robinson was appointed as a special envoy in the Great Lakes region, she for the first time in Eastern Congo involved women and women's group in sort of developing strategies on responding and protecting populations from armed groups. And the results were amazing. I mean, did it stop the problem? Not really, but it really enhanced the way that the mission was able to provide protection and respond better to populations at risk. So I think it's always important to include women. It's always, I mean, we are all saying that, we all know it. It's the questions of how, and within the R2P community and in terms of preventing atrocities more effectively, we just have to have a better understanding of how different crimes impact gender, and our understanding has to be more nuanced and go beyond just sexual and gender-based violence. It has to take into account different ways different genders are affected. So it's not only about women, but having not only male but other genders and LGBTQI communities, how they're all impacted. So that's where I'll stop.
Thank you so much. It was very important that you noted the gender sensitivity of this agenda, and gender mainstreaming is the next level on how to implement these with a specific focus on women and any sort of other gender. And maybe lastly, I know you have covered this occasionally in answering your questions, but maybe as a wrap-up question, can you please a little bit elaborate on the link of R2P and this particular Security Council resolution? What are the resemblances in this arena?
So, I mean, as I've said before, like, I mean, as we all know here in this room, that genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing all have gendered impact. Yeah. And also UNSCR Resolution 1325 and 1820 have affirmed that rape and other forms of sexual violence can constitute war crimes, crimes against humanity, or a constitutive act with respect to crime of genocide. So, I mean, there is a lot of sort of overlapping elements within R2P and WPS. And I think that implementation of both the agendas in a systematic way can benefit the other. And in that context, like just a couple of points, like what international community or national actors can do. So again, I mean, from pillar one aspect of it in terms of enhancing 1325, and I mean, many women in this room who have worked on this for many different actors too have worked on this, know that prevention of widespread sexual and gender-based violence starts at the time of peace. So the more robust national laws you have, the more robust institutional mechanisms you have to protect women, the less permissive environment it creates for the commission of crimes during war times. Also, I mean, women's rights are human rights. So I think that, systematically thinking about it, inclusion of women in prevention and response strategies. I think it's also important to engage men, community leaders, and how they can play an important role in addressing gender stereotypes and societal exclusion. It's important that states take important steps in terms of delivering justice around sexual and gender-based violence and other kinds of discrimination that women and particular genders are subjected to. And if they're not, if they are themselves sort of undermining this responsibility of delivering justice to women, then the international community should step in through ICC referrals and through also by exercising something called universal jurisdiction. The other thing I would say is that for the UN Security Council, I mean, this could be easily done and should and could be done, and we have done this in some cases, is to make better use of targeted sanctions in terms of preventing and halting of sexual violence by including or basing lists, I mean, listing criteria on people who are perpetrating sexual violence. That's another thing. And training on gender sensitivity, on preventing sexual exploitation, on identifying components, identifying and responding to indicators of sexual and gender-based violence for police as well as military nationally, as well as for peacekeepers for pre-deployment training. So again, gender sensitivity. The third is sort of survivor-centric approaches. I think that we need to do more on this. We need to think more in terms of what survivors want, what survivors need, rather than what we want to sort of provide. So, from medical, psychosocial, socioeconomic assistance, it's really, really important. And also, I mean, it's important also in terms of sort of the long-term healing of different societies which have been ravaged by some of these crimes. And I mean, the Yazidi community comes to mind in this context. And finally, I would just like to say that, gender sensitivity is context specific. All of this stuff is context specific. So we need to listen more. We need to listen to people who are actually the most important stakeholders, the populations that are at risk of atrocity crimes, women that are facing these kinds of crimes, women that face gender inequality, and include them in processes of how to address them. So that's where I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the important remarks. And next, we will keep up our conversation with Grant Shubin. He is the legal director of the Global Justice Center, leading all of its legal projects with research, writing, editing, and coordination. He has contributed to Center's shadow report submissions to human rights treaty bodies, as well as legal briefings to the Human Rights Council, the UN Secretary General, Special Rapporteur on Sexual Violence in Conflict, International Criminal Court, the European Commission and European Parliament, and many other national level policymakers. He has published and spoken on international legal issues, ranging from the human rights implications of identity politics and the law governing peace agreements. Grant, thank you so much. I love to see gentlemen in the room when we speak on women's rights and women's empowerment. I am a strong advocate of he for she's. So thank you so much for being a part of this important conversation. And surely both Mavic and Savita really discussed the links between women's contributions and to this important agenda, the resolution and Security Council's documents. And but I still want to hear from your perspective as well on the role of women in preventing atrocity crimes, and more importantly, Global Justice Center is a pioneer in this field, one of the leading institutions. So I would like to learn more about the best practices of your center in combating the mass atrocity crimes.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be here and to share the panel with my amazing colleagues and friends, Savita and Mavic. It's nice to see you both and to be sharing the panel with you. I've thought a lot about this question. What are women's roles in preventing mass atrocity crimes? And in many ways, my answer, Savita has covered, I think, the real core of it. And I'll be saying many of the same things, just from maybe a little bit slightly of a legal perspective. But at the core of it, I'm a bit hesitant to articulate that women have a specific role in preventing atrocity crimes, or that assume that there's any essentialized women's role or role for women generally. And Savita mentioned atrocities have specific context. They have very, very specific historical and political and social factors that all go into the commission of atrocity crimes. I think those are very important to keep in mind in looking at the role, women's role, the quote unquote women's role, but also the role that gender plays in the commission and lead up and response to atrocity crimes. And again, like Savita mentioned, depending on the context, you have different sexes and different genders experiencing the atrocities differently. And there's very prominent examples going back to Rwanda and ISIS of women being perpetrators of mass atrocities. And I do think that gets overlooked from time to time. But I think that the connective tissue and the link is that mass atrocity crimes are extremely gendered. And that is very easy and simple to say, that gender permeates every stage of atrocity crime and is woven into the perpetrator's planning and the commission of atrocity crimes. And gender is exploited to maximize the impact of the particular crime, depending of what it is. And from looking at past atrocities, we know that, speaking very generally, women and female and male members of targeted groups, by the perpetrator's design, experience atrocity crimes in different ways according to their gender. So men and older boys, again, very generally, are targeted because typically they're seen as fulfilling social gendered roles of heads of household, of leaders, of religious authorities, of protectors of the social fabric, of guardians of the group's identity and as patriarchs. Women and girls, on the other hand, again, very generally, the attacks on women and girls reflect their social roles as mothers and wives and daughters, bearers of future life, keepers of the community and family's honor, and sources of labor within the home. So, in other words, an understanding of what it means to be male and female in a particular society saturates the perpetrator's conceptions of their victims and of themselves as committing and the means in which they commit these atrocities. And of course, the violence directed against women and girls during atrocity crimes often reflects misogynistic attitudes in society. And the traumatic impacts of these attacks are magnified by the particular discriminations that women and girls often face in terms of financial discrimination, social discrimination, cultural inequalities that affected them prior to the outset of violence. So on GJC's best practices, or on the things that GJC works on, we seek to use the law and the implementation and the realization of the enforceability of international law to try to bring these gendered experience into the international communities, or depending on the context, the national jurisdictions approach to preventing, prosecuting, and responding generally to mass atrocity crimes. And we do this in any number of ways. That sometimes is in partnership with grassroots women's rights activists, primarily for the past several years has been based in Burma or sometimes in Iraq. But we also work at the international stage in multinational fora like the United Nations, the Human Rights Council, the Security Council, the General Assembly, and with separate ministries of foreign affairs, in order to make sure that the responses to gender atrocities, or the responses to atrocities more generally, have a gendered perspective. Because, like Savita very astutely pointed out, atrocities as committed with a gendered perspective on atrocities is all too often reduced to sexual violence. And that is not it's not what WPS envisions, and it's not a meaningful way in order to prevent atrocities, no matter what they are, notwithstanding the particular gendered ways in which they are committed. And so GJC seeks to bring a feminist perspective to international law, to international actors, to the enforcers of international law, to the courts or the other mechanisms where international law is being brought to bear either on perpetrators or on states in order to make sure that responses and actions seeking to prevent mass atrocities have a gendered perspective. And the last point I would make is that, you asked about, what is women's roles in preventing mass atrocities? I kind of punted on that because I think that that's a very complex question, and in many ways I don't think that you can essentialize a specific women's experience. But I do think it's also true that oftentimes on the ground, it's women's rights organizations, and specifically those that adopt a feminist approach, that are taking a in many ways revolutionary perspective to dealing with the crimes as they're experienced in their community. And the women's rights organizations are often the ones that are challenging the logics of war, of occupation, of militarism, of extractivism, of colonialism, and generally bringing a rights-based framework into a particular context approach to atrocities. And that role of women's-led civil society organizations shouldn't be overlooked.
Thank you so much. And following your remarks on sexual abuse as well, a form of a gender-based crime, I would like to quote the Article 10 of the resolution, which calls on all parties to armed conflict to take special measures to protect women and girls from gender-based violence. So sexual abuse can be the number one violation that comes to my mind, but I believe the definition can be a little bit broader than that, not only sexual abuse. So can you please inform us on the forms of these crimes, like gender-based crimes? What kind of crimes are taking in place in the conflict zones? And maybe to add on to that as well, you also mentioned about the role of international community, but where do you stand? How far do you think the international community come to combat such violations?
Yeah, thank you. Happy to answer those. And I think that there are, in terms of what are the gender-based crimes, I think that there's two different ways to answer that question. And I think one is that all atrocity crimes are gendered. They all, no matter what it is, they all have a gendered element. And I think that looking at, to use an example, the Rohingya genocide of 2016-2017 is a very illustrative example, because in that situation of atrocity, in that genocide, you had lots and lots of different crimes. But looking specifically at killing, the means and manner by which men and women were killed were distinctly different on the basis of a hyper-militarized and misogynistic understanding of what it is to be a male or a female according to the Tatmadaw and within the Rohingya community. So men and boys were typically shot with bullets, shot with the way that other soldiers are shot. Women and girls were oftentimes slaughtered with blades and or put in homes, and those homes were burned down, more reflecting the ways that the community dispatches of property, whether it be livestock or a home. And I think that's a very subtle, very real expression of how gendered is played out in the actual acts of atrocity crimes. So, the question being, what are gender-based crimes? All atrocity crimes are gender-based. If you look hard enough and you look subtly enough, you're able to see the perpetrators have gender conceptions in their head as they perpetrate these crimes. I think it's very important to bring a holistic gender perspective, both, I think, to Savita's point, in what are the underlying gender discriminations, what are the underlying gender dynamics that show a risk of atrocity crime, but also in the prosecution of these crimes to make sure that there's a full understanding and a full accounting of the crimes as they occur. The second way to answer the question is that, of course, gender sometimes is the primary motivating factor for a crime to be committed, and you describe sexual violence, which is a very prominent example, but it's not only sexual violence. And in looking at how far the international community has come in understanding and responding to gender-based crimes, in some ways, it's come quite far. There's a very famous quote from the Nuremberg Tribunal where a prosecutor was asked why sexual violence wasn't prosecuted, and his response was that we didn't want a bunch of crying women in the courtroom. That was the orientation of the prosecutors in Nuremberg on sexual violence. But since then, they're primarily coming out of the prosecutions resulting from the atrocities occurring in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. Sexual violence is generally accepted as a crime worthy of international attention, and it's no longer seen as an unfortunate byproduct of war. And that's a very recent phenomenon, really going back to the 90s, and that's a very major accomplishment. So in the tribunals adjudicating the crimes from the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, there's decisions establishing that sexual violence is torture, that sexual violence can be a crime against humanity, that sexual violence can be a war crime, that rape can be a constituting act of genocide. And those tribunals, the ICTY and the ICTR, kind of graduating to the International Criminal Court. The Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has a whole gender and sexual violence strategy, and to date has two standing convictions for sexual violence as a crime against humanity, and for forced marriage and forced pregnancy. And so, how far has the international community come? Sexual violence is seen as an issue of international attention. That comes out of the ICTY and ICTR. There's a growing expression of the ICC prosecutors' gender priorities. But then, of course, there's also the WPS agenda, and the WPS agenda having a whole branch dedicated to conflict-related sexual violence with a special representative of the Secretary General who brings to bear the full authority of the United Nations on countries and perpetrators credibly suspected of committing sexual violence. And through the WPS agenda, through the periodic resolutions that come out, there's been a real building of the normative framework on what sexual violence in conflict is and how it needs to be responded to. And that it now includes things like a survivor-centered approach. And so it's really quite remarkable how far the international community has come, but it's not far enough, of course. And as Savita pointed out, it's gender-based violence isn't only sexual violence. I think all too often those two issues are collapsed, and we're beginning to see a little bit of expansion in the thinking on that, in particular in the ICC, in the recent Ongwen decision. I think that the Uyghur genocide and situation there is another example of breaking free a little bit of this very strict association of sexual violence with gender-based violence. But there's also only two standing convictions at the ICC. There's a large compliance gap with the SG's reports on CRSV. So all the countries that have been named in the Secretary General's, I don't even know, 10 reports on sexual violence and conflict. Many of those are not ceasing to use sexual violence as a tactic of war. Oftentimes, we're not seeing gender fully reflected and gendered experiences fully reflected in reparations regimes, which is a huge and major gap. And finally, and Savita talked a lot about this, and so I won't go into it in any level of detail, but the predictive mechanisms, the indicating, the risk tools. The international tools and toolkits at looking at the risk of atrocity crimes are extremely gender blind. They very rarely mention women, and where they do, they link them with children as a population of people that needs protection, not as adults who have autonomy and experience in any other way. And not only that, but men are not considered in these instruments as being possible victims of sexual violence. Women are very much put in that corner and treated in that way. So those are some of the failings, or those are some of the issues that need to be worked on in terms of the international, how far the international community has come. But looking at the 30,000-foot level in the past 30 years, there's been quite the progress that should be applauded.
Definitely, I agree with that. Thank you so much. And maybe lastly, I know that Global Justice Center is also monitoring specific country case situations as well. And I would love to hear one or two maybe country case analysis where women's participation at the peace building processes, maybe negotiations or whatsoever, result in ending the conflict. Can you please share some best examples?
Yeah, sure. In many ways, I think Mavic actually is better situated to answer this question than I am. So Mavic, feel free to correct or add to whatever my answer is. But I think that the most prominent example of women's participation in the peace building process is in helping to resolve a conflict, and you have to point to Liberia, the Liberian peace process and the women's peace movement that was led by Lima Gaboe. And I won't go into the details of that because I think that if you're at the CSW event, you're probably familiar with the truly amazing and inspiring work that Ms. Gaboe led and that the women peace builders in Liberia were able to realize. But I think that there are a few key takeaways from that example that we can talk about, and many of which Mavic has touched on and Savita has touched on. And one of those takeaways is that the women's peace movement in Liberia really proved that grassroots movements are essential to establishing sustainable peace. Like, it's not possible without grassroots women's voices. That the Liberian peace process really proved that peace is not a top-down process that starts at the UN. That it starts on the ground. It starts with grassroots movements, and it starts really in that example, and I think in many examples, that women are the drivers of peace. And I think that that's another obvious example that can be learned from the Liberian experience. That I think expressly claiming the space of being the conscience of the society and of the culture in that context, to say we're occupying this space as the conscience of society, and that conscience is essential and relevant to discovering peace in this situation, and women occupying and filling that role in order to bring a new perspective that is impossible when your only language is a language of violence. And I think a third takeaway from the Liberian example is that power and opportunity to discover peace, to get into a framework wherein peace is possible, is often locked away in marginalized voices. In the Liberian peace process, the women were not invited to the peacemaking table, but they found a way to make themselves heard. They understood the risks of their voices not being heard, and they designed and catered their activism in a manner that maximized their social and moral leverage in order to be heard, to make a difference, and to ensure that women's voices, that the voices of peace, that the voices of conscience were brought to bear in making sure a peace process happened in the first place, but also that they was present during the actual peace process. So that to me is a very shining example of how women's participation in peace process really led to ending the conflict, to achieving sustainable peace. But I also think that Right now, we're in a situation in Myanmar where maybe we're not quite at this a situation of achieved peace yet, but that's very much a situation where women's civil society, feminist civil society, has been extremely well organized for a very long time. Has been making calls for the international community to do something about military impunity for sexual violence, about military independence and supremacy over the civilian government, and for a federalist democratic republic. These are things that women's ethnic groups in Burma have been calling on for years and years and years. And after the recent coup in February, you're also seeing many of these very well organized women's rights actors and organizations in the country leading in the protest movements against the military junta. And so, again, we're very far away from a sustainable peace in Myanmar. But when a sustainable peace is finally achieved, it will be because of the contributions of women's civil society that have been vocal and active and making a difference in Myanmar for a generation, really. So I wanted to add that one bit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Grant, for the wonderful remarks. And we took the issue from the Security Council resolution introduction implementation phase, government responsibilities, and really covered a great deal of crimes against humanity, where these puzzles really merge in together, and of course, women as stakeholders in building long-lasting peace. I have several questions that I have seen in the chat box. I would like to refer to them now. Thank you, everyone, for their engagement. And maybe I can read out the questions, and anyone is more than welcome to jump in and share their own views. The first one is from Nina Lahod. As the panelists have raised their interlinked global frameworks of women, peace, security agenda, the youth, peace, security agenda, and the responsibility to protect, I have a continued concern regarding the lack of sufficient focus on the need to ensure systematic and coordinated implementation of these three different frameworks, which I feel should be spearheaded by the UN Secretary General. Nina is asking, what is your view on this regards? I think Mavik has put a little emphasis on youth as well. Maybe we can start with her, and Savita and Grant is more than welcome to share their remarks too.
Thank you, Semre, and thank you, Nina, for that important question. I'm sure you are aware that in 2015, there were three important reviews that the UN commissioned or commissioned and supported. They are the Global Study on Resolution 1325, the High-Level Peace Operations Review, and the Peace Building Architecture Review. There was one very important common findings among those three reviews. What is that? It is that one of the problems of the weakness in implementation in the UN's international peace and security response is the lack of coordination. The mandates among the different agencies and entities are instead of promoting the synergy, it is creating silos or divides among the different mandates. And many member states, including the United States at the time, highlighted that review. And that finding from those three reviews is also emphasized in this conversation. The need to have a synergistic, integrative, intersectional response to conflict and humanitarian emergencies by emphasizing how we should work together in implementing women, peace and security agenda, youth peace and security, the response to mass atrocities and humanitarian emergencies. So civil society has been talking about the need to break the silos in the different mandates, and women have, you know, especially local women, we always say we don't live our lives in mandates. Our lives are just one continuum. Our problem, you know, during humanitarian emergencies are very much related to our problems when there's a civil war in our country. So they're not separate. Our problem as women above 30 years old are very much informed by the violence, by the discrimination, by the marginalization that we experienced when we were girls and young women. So you cannot separate the youth peace and security and women peace and security agenda. So Nina, you know, oh, I should also mention that part of our advocacy on this, you know, breaking down the silos, we, the Global Network of Women Peace Builders, for many years, in 2007 until it was adopted in 2013, continuing to now, this is the CEDAW General Recommendation 30 on women in peace building, conflict prevention, and women in conflict situations, which actually calls on or requires state parties to CEDAW to integrate reporting on women, peace, and security implementation in their compliance reports, which is really, really very powerful. I don't have the concrete statistics now, but as you know, as up until 2018, there were over 40 states parties who were already reporting. And remember, there's a lot of resistance in using the global indicators, but in CEDAW, there's no escaping their reporting. So our advocacy resulted into a cooperation framework between the CEDAW committee and the Office of the Special Representative Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict, so that they will be sharing information, because, you know, CEDAW is, you know, requiring member states to report on the women, peace, and security agenda, including their response to conflict-related sexual violence. So they have all of that information from member states as well as civil society, which, by the way, also report through the shadow reporting mechanism, which is very powerful because they're given equal weight by the CEDAW committee. So that information is shared with the SRSG, Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict, and vice versa. All the information collected by the Office of Pramila Patten is also shared with the CEDAW, so they can include them in their constructive dialogue with member states. But that's only one example of coordination, and I totally agree with you, Nina. We need to have a discussion with the Office of the Secretary General on how we can have a holistic, strong coordination mechanism. And just to add to the point earlier that was asked, asked that Semre, you asked Grant, and thank you, Grant, for you know pointing out that I might have some information to share on good practices in terms of women's influence in peace processes. Another good example is the Colombian experience. As we keep saying, as women peace builders, we need to put women in the negotiation table. And by that, we refer to the official track 1 peace process. But the other part of our advocacy is we need to reshape the table. We need to redesign the table, because right now the table is a two-sided table only, with one side, the government often represented by high-level military official or ex-prime minister or ex-minister, and then the other side is by the represented by the armed groups, non-state armed groups, the rebels. And in the Philippines, we had, by the way, we had this experience. I come from the Philippines when women peace builders who had been advocating for conflict prevention, conflict resolution for decades and wanted a seat at the table, the first question asked to them by the facilitators were, did you hold the guns? And they said, no, but our lives have been devastated because of the war, and we've been working to build peace and prevent conflict. Oh, but this negotiations about the war, it's for warring parties. So the premium is on those who are waging the war, not on those waging the peace. So in Colombia, and here I commend UN Women for supporting the a very broad women's summit where women from all across the country, indigenous women, Afro-Colombians, LGBTQI, and many other women's rights organizations came together and talked about what are their bottom lines, what are their shared messages, what are their common advocacy points, because Colombia is a very divided country, very diverse ideologies and different agenda, but they came together and came up with their common agenda, and with support of UN Women, and I believe Norway too, and others, they chose their representatives coming from rural Colombia and conflict-affected communities, and they traveled them to Havana to meet with the principal peace negotiators. And because of that, the peace agreement that came out of that negotiation between the FARC and the government had the most number of gender provisions, over, I think, about 122 out of 300 something provisions, very, very strong on gender, including, rights of victims, reparations, support for rural women, ownership of the land, etc. But it is a very successful document. But again, the other important challenge to address is the implementation of the peace agreement. And that is the other important part of our advocacy. Ensure that women, especially local women and youth, are participants in implementing the peace agreement. Otherwise, it's just a piece of paper. And we've seen in some, in many cases, more than 50% of the peace agreements have been violated. And some, even before the ink that was used to sign them has dried. And South Sudan is a very good example of this.
Thank you, Mavik, for this detailed response. And Savita, Grant, maybe very short remarks, because our audience is very engaged in the conversation, and there are some topics that we haven't raised, and they're asking if you have some brief remarks to add on this one.
Emily, if it is okay with Grant, I would suggest let's move on to other questions, because I think Mavik answered them very well. So, the more questions we can take, the better.
Sure. Grant, do you have any other remarks that you would like to add on, or should I keep up the conversation?
Yeah, happy to move to other questions.
Okay, so we have two people asking about widows, and that was interesting to me because we haven't covered this issue. Heather Ibrahim is saying widows constitute between 70 to 80% of the female population of the conflict and post-conflict situations, and are the key victims of mass atrocities. Conflict is the cause of the young widow and the child widow, yet they remain invisible in the narrative. There is no single mention of widows in 1325, and asking your position in that regards. And Jack also is raising the same issue, so maybe we can merge the questions together. How can we better address the needs of combatant widows in the regions that exclude widows from inheriting or participating in the formal economy? So economy is in hand and not mention of the widows in the agenda is also at the point. So maybe Savita, Grant, would you like to take a lead?
I think Mavic is much more well placed to answer this question. I'm sorry, I would not. I mean, I absolutely think they should be, but I'll stop there.
Sure, Mavic, if you want to join in.
Yes. The rights of widows and the rights of combatants are, definitely important important issues that must be integrated in peace negotiations. And here I want to cite the example of Nepal. And they have a very well organized community-based groups of widows and orphans. And the interesting action that Nepal government in their national action planning process is that they did not come up with the draft. They did not start with the draft. I call it no draft approach, but they went across the country and spoke with many, they covered more than 50% of the country, wherein they met with community-based groups, including, as I said, orphans and widows and former combatants. And because of that, they were able to gather their perspectives, and from the many issues that they point out, they drafted the national action plan. So it reflects broad issues and broad ownership of the people. And interestingly, sometimes, because I was the international consultant for the first national action plan of Nepal, and there were so many recommendations, and sometimes you'd think, how is this related to women, peace, and security? For example, the orphans and those who are taking care of the orphans, they said the national action plan should ensure scholarship for children who have been orphaned by the war. The national action plan should ensure economic support and livelihood support, including job skills training for combatants, especially women combatants. And this also, I need to point out that one of the problems in the recovery support in especially around job training for former combatants, is it's very male oriented. So the training is on automotive, refrigeration, and training to be electrician, and that's fine. Some women like those, like to be trained in those skills areas too. But there are women who say, oh, I would like to open a small restaurant. I would like to open, I would like to train to be a teacher. So it's reinforcing the traditional roles of women and men, and usually more geared towards the men. And one good example of integrating support for economic empowerment is in the peace agreement, also in Colombia, but also in the Philippines, where there is an exact percentage for the funding for the implementation of peace agreement that should go to gender and development programs of local governance units, meaning municipalities and villages in cities, and that those gender and development programs should go to supporting female ex-combatants and orphans and widows of the war. So yeah, there's several examples that really could be replicated. And I think this point is also related to Nina's concern about the lack of coordination. And because of that, we are not able to harvest the best examples that are available from the different experiences in different countries, and especially local communities.
Thank you so much, Mavic. And there is one interesting question that I want to spend some time on it, from Ben Julian. How do you view the role of faith movements, the women's faith organizations in working for peace at grassroots levels? I think this is important because like the cases of widows, we don't see much reference for inter-religious dialogue. And this applies to SDGs as well, not only peace building agenda. And that's an interesting issue, and I would like to learn more about your perspectives as well. How do you see faith movements in establishing long-lasting peace? A challenging question. No, anyone can jump in.
Yeah, I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but since no one is taking the floor, well, there are now 96 national action plans, as I think I've mentioned, but the challenge is less than 25% of those national action plans do not have funding. Some do not have monitoring and evaluation mechanism. But let me just focus on funding. Here I would like to quote the Ministry of Peace and Reconstruction, Minister of Peace and Reconstruction of Nepal that we work with. And he said, a national action plan without dedicated funding is like a car without fuel. So it's almost a guarantee that it will only gather dust on the shelves of the government bureaucracy if there's no dedicated funding for a national action plan. So and one of the things that we have been doing, I don't know if you're familiar with the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund. I think Semra mentioned it. We lobbied and advocated. Yeah, we advocated for it until it's finally officially launched in 2016. Our advocacy was that it's not only for civil society to receive funds for their work or governments to receive funds to support the implementation of national action plans or local action plans, but civil society to be in decision making, to be on the board of the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund. So we have a say on how the funds are raised and utilized. And fortunately, that is happening already. The Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund supports about 300 women's rights and civil society groups at the local level for their work on women, peace, and security, but still very, very small. But while we champion national action plan, there's still a number of governments, and Colombia is an example, who don't have appetite to develop national action plans. They just, for a number of reasons. So what we did is we went to the local communities, to the municipalities, to the villages, and the mayors and the indigenous leaders and Afro-Colombian leaders said, we're not going to wait for our national governments while they are dragging their feet and don't want to adopt a national action plan. The Resolution 1325, Resolution 1820, and the supporting resolutions are important for us. We can really use this to support our constituencies, especially the women. And therefore, because we have mandate as local authorities, we will develop local action plans. So that's what they did. So there, in Colombia, I believe there are about 19 local action plans, different municipalities and different departments. So they're not waiting for the national government to decide on a national action plan. And maybe that's the other strategy that some of you can consider.
I might add, so unless Savita, you had anything you wanted to, I might add on the specific role. I think there are two interesting and in some ways contradictory examples of the role of faith leaders at least in the Commission of Mass Atrocities. And one is the ISIS, the way in which the leaders of the Yazidi community responded to the crimes perpetrated by ISIS, and in particular crimes of sexual and gender-based violence. There's very profound and public appeals from the supreme religious leadership saying, the survivors of this violence, it's not their fault. We need to welcome them back in within the fray of our community. The shame does not belong on them. And really taking a lead in bringing and trying to push back against the ostracization that we know so often comes with sexual and gender-based violence. I think that's so there's obviously a lot you can say about the specific Yazidi example, but I think that being a positive example of the role of religious leaders. I think on the other side, you can look at Myanmar and the danger of religious community leaders in stoking sectarian and religious hatred, and the role that the nationalist Buddhist extremist monks had in stoking the violence against the Rohingya in that country. And so I think that at its worst, religious leadership can exacerbate and contribute to the underlying conditions of humanization that lead to mass atrocities. I think at its best, it can help create a holistic approach for the reintegration of survivors in a very, very needed situation.
And just to add to what Grant said, I mean, absolutely. I mean, they're just such, I mean, on two opposing ends in terms of the role the religious leaders play. But then I think that there's also such a gap with, I mean, you know, in terms of having any kind of women religious leaders. I mean, their space is so dominated by men that, I mean, I know that the Office of Genocide Prevention and R2P has done a lot of work with religious leaders, and especially some of the very positive ones. I mean, in the Central African Republic, they played an important role in terms of sort of building bridges and calming down the ethnic tensions. But I mean, on the other end, in terms of sort of the reinforcement of certain kind of gender stereotyping and gender roles, I mean, that's also problematic. So I mean, I think it's a mixed bag.
Thank you so much, Savita. Maybe before we close our discussion, Lopod and Heli is asking a specific regional question. Any peace building programs for working women in East Africa? And Heli is saying, keeping 1325 in mind, do you have how do you get more women to the table in Afghanistan? So maybe Savita or Grant, you have more country-specific based researchers or monitoring systems. Would you like to answer to any of them? East Africa and Afghanistan is in hand.
I mean, I have worked with some fantastic women from East Africa who are, but I mean, I'm not in the peace building community, so I can't really speak to peace building initiatives there. In terms of sort of bringing women to the table, I think it's a continuous struggle. I mean, it doesn't matter which region we are in. I mean, as Mavic said, as Grant said, and I said in our presentations, I think that, you know, it's absolutely acknowledged and understood the role that women play. I mean, it's actually kind of just not useful to even point to the fact that how useful women are. And they are really amazing peace builders at a local level in terms of, like, you know, in terms of sort of also just being actors who provide humanitarian assistance within their own communities. But the problem is that, you know, it still remains a huge issue in terms of women's participation at a national and international level. And I mean, it's not only you know, limited to sort of conflict situations or situations in the global south. I mean, it's everywhere. So I think that that's a global problem that we women and men need to just keep fighting and making sure that we are including the right kind of people around the table.
Thank you, Savita. Grant, do you have any additional remarks for that? Afghanistan and East Africa.
No, unfortunately, I don't.
Okay. Thank you so much. Maybe lastly, Mehmet Klik is also adding that going back to the influence of religious movements for peace building, he's saying that I think Pope Francis' historic visit to Iraq is very promising to build peace from the perspective of religious leaders. And lastly, as a national security experts. I see from the comments that my father is also watching us, Mesut Alker. He's saying women are the best peace builders of the world. Yes, definitely. I totally agree with that. So wrapping up our discussion, time is almost over. But I have seen engaging comments, questions from Israel, Cyprus, Ireland, Ukraine, South Korea. So thank you so much for this diverse audience joining us for today's discussion. And I would like to say that women's full and equal participation at all levels of society is a fundamental human right indeed. And a meaningful participation of women requires a building block of access to resources, knowledge, formal training, very important, social services, and of course, financial support. That's an important factor as well. And for our global community to emerge from this health crisis, pandemic, more equal, resilient, and aiming towards lasting and inclusive peace, we have to join our efforts to really stand for women's empowerment in all spheres of public and political arenas. Gender equality and women's empowerment is a foundation for peaceful and prosperous, sustainable world. So, Grant, Savita, Mavic, thank you so much for sharing your time from your busy and tight schedules to join with us today at this important discussion. That was a pleasure and honor to have you all. Thank you so much. So I hope to see you all again in further collaborations, and I really appreciate your contributions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.